Welcome to Politics and Reform, where we'll be talking about a variety of topics pertaining to criminal justice reform, police brutality, systemic racism, and issues within our regional communities. We are here to talk and inform not only ourselves, but our audience with the opinions and critiques of those individuals that practice in these fields. Today, we're here with Danny Glover, a phenomenal actor you may know from the Lethal Weapon series, and a longtime civil rights activist. Danny, it's great to talk with you today.
Well, it's great to be on this call right here, or Zoom call, as they call it now.
Yeah.
And to talk with you, it's Canal.
Yeah. And how are you doing in this world of COVID?
Well, I'm doing well. I'm sheltered in place and staying safe.
Good.
I wear my mask. I wash my hands. I do all the prerequisite things that are necessary to keep safe and others safe as well.
Exactly.
When we talk about this moment, this Zoom moment, or this pandemic moment, we have to think about not only ourselves but those people around us as well.
Exactly.
And maybe that puts us in a position to be a more caring people.
Right.
But who knows? We're learning so much about ourselves in this particular moment, and a great deal of what we're learning, hopefully, it translates into a better way, a different way in which we respect, honor each other as human beings as well.
Right. And I completely agree. I concur. And, without further ado, let's get started with the first question, Danny. Now, I want to ask, tell the audience or the viewers a little bit about yourself, just beyond your acting career in Hollywood, your activism, such as your involvement in the political atmosphere. Maybe you want to talk about, you being a surrogate for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. It's up to you.
Well, one of the things, first of all, let's get something very clear. Being an actor is the most unlikely thing that I thought when I was your age at all. There's no sense, or even younger than that, or even a little bit older than that age, as in young adult. And the first thing that I would like to express in the most, and I don't know how clear this will come across to people, and particularly young people, that if not I've been involved in movements. I'm a child of the civil rights movement. I was born in 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II, the war that would end all wars. I'm a child of that civil rights movement. I'm shaped by the ideas and ideals of the civil rights movement.
Right.
So that's the first movement that I became involved in as a child, as I've watched it unfold on television. I've watched the Montgomery bus boycott come into light, and all of a sudden, these people that I saw as a young 9-year-old child, these people look like me.
Right.
They look like me, and what they were doing, I felt was important. Did I know the significance of what they were doing? No, not really as an 8-year-old, but I got some idea from my parents, the way they interpreted, the way they embraced that moment, that it was very, very, very important. Well, it is. That moment for me is that moment for young people today.
Right.
Whatever is happening, that was the beginning, that was the start. And in 1955, that the courageous men and women in Montgomery, Alabama, went on a bus strike and said they would not ride that bus until they were treated like they were human beings. They would not ride in the segregated back. They would not employ, and they would employ other means of getting transportation to school and work, but they would not ride that bus. They were called everything. They were called communists. They were called agitators. They were called so many different things, but they stood tall, and they redefined themselves as human beings in that. And that was something I learned. I couldn't digest that at 9 years old, didn't know that at 9 years old, but that was the beginning there. So basically, this profession that I've been doing, that I've been involved in for well over 45 years. Well over 45 years. That is an actor. That this profession that I've been involved in is a result of all the things that have come in my life and the essential part of what has come to my life is being engaged, involved in movements, whether the young students who marched and who segregated in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Woolworth's lunch counter. I was 14 years old when I saw them. It was all over the news and all over television. To Freedom Summer in 1964. I was 18 years old and graduating from high school. All these movements were movements that reflect and in so many different ways define my generation and specifically define me as well.
Right.
So the acting came as a result of that. And one point I realized that I could do something with passion and say something about it.
Right.
The great Paul Robeson once said that artists are the gatekeepers of truth. That it's not enough for an artist, this is what he said, not enough for an artist to create the reality that is, but his responsibility, his or her responsibility is to create the possibility of what life and what the reality could be.
Right.
To imagine. Yeah.
And I think you've laid the groundwork and the framework for others to follow in your footsteps. You know, I look to you as not only a mentor, but I think an icon in not only your acting profession, but also who and what you've inspired. I think that's phenomenal that you're involved in the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. And I think it's fantastic that you are leading these movements and such as, you know, you're engaged with the public, you're engaged with the recent events, and you're also part of the Algebra Project. And
I'm a part of the Algebra Project, which is an extraordinary project that developed by an extraordinary human being, someone who was directly involved in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, where he was shot, beaten, and jailed for doing the simple thing of providing a corridor or an avenue for people who had not voted forever, for a long time, to register and vote. He was beaten and shot, and many people died as a result of that. So when we talk about voting and our willingness to vote, the fact is that remember that people died for the right to vote.
Exactly.
People actually died for that in the 20th century. Just long they died for the right to vote.
Right.
And it's almost unconscionable the right to vote. There's no neutral place where you can be. As Dante said, and Dr. King always created the great philosopher Dante, saying the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in a moral crisis maintain their neutrality. Exactly. There's no neutral place. You have to be a citizen and vote and use your voice to change. But also, not only do you have to use your voice to change at the ballot box, you have to use your voice and your feet and your legs and your body to bring about the real change that you want, that we want to see.
Right. And for those of the viewers that don't know, Bob Moses, a civil rights activist, started the Algebra Project, and kind of moving on into the modern day. You know, recent events such as the death of George Floyd and this entire, you know, Black Lives movement that we've seen in this decade, I'd like to argue, you know, and it shows the passion and the anger of, you know, young Americans, even old Americans in some cases. And so I want to ask, you know, what was your reaction to these protests and these calls for defunding the police and demilitarization of the police and eventually the riots that formed for those who were opportunistic?
Well, there are many things that happened. You know, the reaction or response to the injustice of the public lynching of George Floyd. It was a response to that, a reaction, and people marched and used their bodies and got on the street and protested that. And for police all across the country, they put the police, and all those institutions which attempt to repress people, they put them on notice right here.
Exactly.
That's what they did. They put them on. Now the question is that how do we organize ourselves in creating the kind of relationships with what we call law enforcement, create the kind of relationship that are healthy, that are affirmative for us as citizens, and particularly citizens of color, as citizens of color, but let's say start with citizens of color, because theirs is the most dramatic situation, citizens of color. So
Right.
we have to, and the question becomes now, can the police force as we know it be reformed? Can it be transformed? That's the question. That's a major question for us. And because we have one thing about us, and the human mind has something else that no one in the animal species has. That's imagination. Now, what do we want to imagine what this relationship is? You know, of course, we define our lives by different things. We know that there's illegal things that happen within that break the law, and there are ways in which citizens break the law. But does that criminalize everyone?
Right.
The sense of that, does that criminalize everyone who is black, or everyone who is LGBTQ, or everyone who is different in some sort of way?
Right.
And so those are the kind of questions that we had to ask. No one says that we don't need some sort of operation, some sort of entity, some sort of social relationship with those people who are there to protect our well-being,
Right.
our well-being. You know, the question about the police has always been, and law enforcement has always been, whose well-being are they protecting? Are they protecting those people who live on the hill in the white ivory towers, or I mean not ivory towers, but with the houses that are in the community? Or they simply are to vilify those people who live in the community, who are often poor, who are often working people, and who are often people of color. Those are the kind of things that we have to talk about. It's real. History only tells you that. History tells you that. We have a long enough time to understand the relationship that policing has had to communities of color. We know that. We've seen it. It's been consistent throughout the history of this country. And so that's the question we have to ask ourselves. What do we want? What do we need? We see the increased militarization of the police. They're given, they resemble, some sort of video game as they march around in our urban communities dressed as if they're in some
With
sort of
tanks.
foreign land.
With tanks, Danny. So
And
in
with
some
tanks,
cases with tanks.
all of that. Wait a minute, what are they saying? What did they say? You often saw the policemen from days and when they were trying to make the police officer someone who is understanding and
Right.
friendly to the community. They'd have a blue uniform on. Sometimes you wouldn't even see the pistol that they had or the instruments that they had. They'd have their little baton, or whatever like this and everything else. But the things now to see them dressed as if you're looking at you somewhere in some war-torn area, some war-torn place, and dressed in there and using military formations. And that is a trend that's been happening for a long time vis-a-vis the law enforcement. That has been happening, and it's been facilitated by the federal government as well.
Right. And I completely agree. I think there's a famous philosopher, Zizek, you may know, and he often talks about, what forms after the revolution, right? Because right now I feel that we're in a reactionary phase to all the, outrage and havoc that not only the federal government has performed, but we're in the midst of a global pandemic, one that hasn't occurred in over 100 years historically. And so, as a reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, I want to ask, as a response, do you think that reparations are needed? Is that a solution to these public protests and shifting perspectives?
The idea of reparation has has been a question since the end of slavery.
Right.
It was first expressed through getting 40 acres and a mule.
Right. Yes.
And certainly while we didn't get 40 acres and a mule, African Americans, formerly enslaved Africans, after the emancipation and after their freedom, were made incredible strides in acquiring land. They made incredible strides in building businesses, and often those businesses and their position in society were a threat to other sectors of
Yes.
society,
To the redeemer classes and the white
and
people in the South.
then white and then other classes right here, other
Yeah.
classes right here. So that's the case when we talk about that. We can only, in 1921, we saw what happened on Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The
Right.
riots that killed, hundreds of people were killed in that riot, and some of them were buried in mass graves and everything. So this kind of violence. So mob violence has always been something that has affected African Americans. A new study by the Justice Institution, run by the Justice Initiative, run by Brian Stevenson, says that between 1865, the end of the Civil War, and 1867, the end of Reconstruction, there were over 2,000 African Americans lynched in that 12-year period. Now, he's already chronicled through his Memorial Plaza in Montgomery, Alabama. He's already determined that from 1877 to 1950, there were more than 4,600 African American men, women, and children who have been lynched. And that's just what he's uncovered right now through his research. We don't know what the number is. So we don't know what the number is. We don't know how many bodies are lying in some deep river in Mississippi, in somewhere, whose bodies have stayed there, and certainly different kind of animals are fed on their bodies. We don't know what those numbers are yet. We don't know how many come up missing and their bodies are never recovered and everything. All these things that happen. So there's this violence that the Black Lives Matters addresses. It is why it says, Black Lives Matter. And they're talking about just at this moment, and the names, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the names Trayvon Martin, and we can go on and on and on and on and on and on. But before the history of this, the historical pattern. This is not something that just all of a sudden is a manifestation of modern American society. This is something throughout the history of this country as well.
Exactly. And I think that, moving on to this next question, solving these issues is a multifaceted variable. I think that, one could describe mass incarceration as being an extension of slavery. And I think that in this case, not only is mass incarceration in that equation, I think the criminal justice system is, I think police accountability is, and to these cases, what do you believe needs to occur with police brutality and this defund the police movement and addressing the systemic oppressions in the criminal justice system and easing these racial tensions? What do we need to do, not only as activists, actors, regular citizens? What do we need to rise up and accomplish?
Well, the first thing that you're going to do, and I think it's necessary to do, is since prosecutors hold a lot of the weight that happens in this system that we live in.
Right.
You got to vote in and vote in progressive prosecutors.
Right.
And not only that they be progressive, that we make them accountable. Citizenship is about making governance accountable to you, not for other interests, to you collectively, to you individually as citizens. So that's what the citizenship means, and that's what making progressive, as well as those who are certainly in power, making them and fight for them and vote them out of power when they're not doing the will of the people itself.
Right.
But that's one step in a sense. And we have to understand the history itself. And this history is important to understand. And how do we get here? As Dr. King often said, how do we get here and where do we go to?
Exactly.
And where do we go to? A wonderful book by Richardson, Slavery by Another Name, where he basically a wonderful book that all of us should read and understand the history and the role that the court system and the sheriff's department played in every single former state, former state in the Confederacy, every
Right.
single one. The work gangs penalizing and criminalizing African Americans for just playing dice or playing something or doing something or just being what they call vagrants and everything. So all these things are part of what is the history, what we call criminalization. Remember, the idea of policing was a phenomena that came out of these states and these places where one, that you had runaway slaves. So you had to get together, draw together men and volunteers who were slave catchers.
Right.
Who were slave, as they call the slave patrol.
Right.
The fact that they didn't say citizens, they said specifically nothing about their responsibility, and most of them were working white people, poor white people who became part of the slave patrol.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to make sure that you kept slaves who were property, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
They were property. Let's distinguish who they were, not citizens. They were property. And that property, they were treated the same kind of way that your horse was treated, or your cow was treated, or your pigs were treated. They were property and they had value because of who they are, were property. So you had the slave patrols all through this happening. And then you had after Reconstruction, you had the threat of violence, that lynching, and after Reconstruction, you had in place the system in which you were penalized for being Black, or penalized for not having someone that you can refer to as your overseer or master.
You had the KKK.
All these systems which had you to involuntary slavery, had you taken away from your family and placed in camps, work camps, and those work camps including working in the fields, the cotton fields. Those work camps include working in steel manufacturing. Those work camps include mining. All those things were part of this history that often vanishes, or this history is that's forgotten or not told us as well.
Right. And so, not only that, how do we, in the modern aspect, right? Historically, we've seen interactions like this before. But in the modern aspect, how do we ease racial tensions today? Like I asked earlier, is reparations the answer? Or is it a reorganization of society that we need?
Suppose we said reparations represented rebuilding African American communities, even though some of those communities have been gentrified.
Right.
The community that I lived here in San Francisco, at one point was primarily African American. And often we are only temporary residents of wherever it is. Before we moved in here and inhabited these homes in the community I lived in because of white flight to the suburbs. And what happened was institutions promoted suburbs and the expansion, and in those suburbs that they moved to, Black people weren't allowed to buy in those suburbs all over this country. So there's a pattern of segregation and pushing Black people away from being full citizens within this country, whether it's redlining and all this. When we look at this, we cannot talk about this until we look at the past. So what does it mean? What could reparations mean? Rebuilding our schools, rebuilding low income housing. What could reparations be? It can creating the kind of work as Jeremy Rifkin in his book, The End of Work. Jeremy Rifkin writes about socially responsible work. What is that socially responsible work?
Right.
Creating daycare and providing people with jobs, creating other ways in which they can be in their community service, and not in that community service, they can actualize themselves in a real way as citizens. These are the kind of things that we can talk about in reparation. Really rebuilding our schools,
Right.
rescuing the public school system. As the school system becomes, the public school system becomes privatized or chartered and whatever, we have to rescue the public school system. It is the gateway and the pathway to citizenship in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century as well.
Right. And so, kind of moving towards a specific avenue, let's talk about the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, right? It's become this economic stimulus, and I think personally, it has been ingratiated within predatory capitalism about how there's an economic advantage for those stakeholders in the prison industrial complex. And like you said, it's been privatized. People profit from the misery of other incarcerated individuals. So I want to ask, what are the steps that we need to take? Because we've seen public outrage about the death of George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor. What steps do we need to take to direct that same passion towards the prison industrial complex, potentially even reforming prisons or moving so drastically to abolish prisons?
Well, one of the things that, since I'm an abolitionist, one of the things that we move toward, whatever the actions we take, is to abolish prisons itself. If of course, there are places where people are dangerous to not only to African and African Americans communities, but to all communities that serve. And certainly, there has to be a place for that. But some of the petty things, if you look at a situation with let's say that if you legalize marijuana for
Right.
recreational purpose or medicinal purpose, if you legalize marijuana in some sense, what does that how does that reduce the kind of court cases and everything else that you find? And there are other ways that you can do that. Yes, you have to have law enforcement and you have to have judges to penalize people. But what's prisons are no longer a place where those men and women who are caught up in that prison industrial complex, where they can learn and they can grow and they can be an asset to community. How do you integrate them back into community as productive citizens?
Right.
And the fact that you take all signs of citizenship away, just in Florida, in other places, in some places, what we've had is that men and women who've had felony records, and et cetera, are able to vote now. It was something passed about 2 years ago in an election in 2018, where voters got the right to, as men and women who have been incarcerated got the right to vote. So there's different kind of ways in which you can break up that, but you have to be able to connect, and you have to say, how can we be responsible human beings? And the question is, what do we mean by being a responsible human being? How do we take care of those? How do we end the prison, this industrial complex, the prison industrial complex? We have to just at the beginning eliminate and eliminate prisons for private prisons. They have to be. If they have no accountability, there's no accountability. The prison has to have some sort of accountability to what happens inside. It has to be some sort of accountability in how our men are treated within these places. All the prisons that we find that are built in such a way is that they further dehumanize those people who are incarcerated. Is that what we want to do? These are the questions that we have to ask them. There are other models. We can talk about films, when Michael Moore's a wonderful film, Who Do We Invade Next? Right. A wonderful film, looks at education in other countries, looked at the prison system in other countries like that, and they seem more humane in a sense. What are the ways in which we can find these humane and move away from these draconian attitudes, draconian policies around prison?
Right. And once again,
and to abolish the death penalty.
Right. And I completely agree. I think it's an incontrovertible fact that there are alternatives, rehabilitative alternatives to prisons. I think there's restorative justice policies. I think there's reentry programs. And I specifically agree that education needs to be made a priority for those individuals, and mental health services need to be avidly requestable to those that are incarcerated. And kind of moving towards this position of, an approach that those in these positions of power should be taking, I want to ask you, what do you think about some politicians, dogmatic and regimented approach to reforming? It's often been dubbed radicalism by a certain majority within the polarized political field. So, what merits a true change in our, oppressive systems?
Well, with marriage is true change. And don't forget, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, if we begin to, if our children matter, if they do matter, we provide all the elements for them to grow and prosper and the potential of their prosperity, no matter what color they are. If they do matter,
Right.
then what we do, we place in front of us, we place as a, use the tools we have available, the technology we have available, the tools we have available, to putting resources into schools, not just throwing money into it, but specifically target those who are the most vulnerable and the ones the ones who basically who are been systemically left out of the system, and that has been often women of color, men of color, and who've been left out of the system. How do we target them? By providing the tools necessary for them to be productive citizens when they become adults. How do we provide education that is useful to them? How do we provide kind of jobs where they feel like they can be a part of the community? Not jobs created by the fast food industry. Those are no jobs. Those are not really jobs. They have no end means to it. I'm not saying that we should have a fast food industry, but even with the fast food industry, we should pay people a living wage. We should be paying at least $15 an hour. Those
At
are the
least.
kind of things that happen in the
Right.
sense. So you come out of school, you finish school, you haven't done as well as you wanted at school. We all mature at different age levels and at different points in our lives. We be mature, but maturity doesn't often come at 18 when you graduate from high school or something else. What are the elements that we now attempt to enrich people's life? How do we get art and music and different forms of interaction back into to
Right.
our schools? They've been removed from our schools. At the same time that those things have been removed from our school, the attention to high school football has just blown up, in different places. And they're often the states that have the most inequity in their history and in their presence as well. So there's different ways and different things that we can talk about and initiate, but communities have to have a voice in it.
Right. And so really what I'm trying to ask is,
It has to be on the local level. This
right.
is nothing something. Yeah.
And I'm really trying to get to this, which is radicalism the answer to our prayers? Is that the approach we need to take?
Well, I tell you what, nothing, never changes never happen. Frederick Douglass says it beautifully when he says, "Power never concedes except on demand. It never has and never
Oh,
will."
well. Yes.
So to understand that it has to be constant, ongoing challenges to this power. We don't want to institutionalize in the ways they would want us to do our response to inequity, our response to injustice, and
Right.
believe that it happens often in the state house or in the federal government or at city hall. We have to believe that we the people have the power. We the people have to organize. And I'm saying that organize in a different way. We often terms about organize. We often look to some sort of leader, some sort of iconic leader for us. The
Right.
leadership in this country comes from us.
Right.
It's
From the
defeating organized resistance, building organized resistance, and defeating that is a hard thing to do.
right.
So you have multiple leaders. You have them coming together and discussing and demanding what they want. And it's not rocket science, is all. We don't have to invent a vaccine for that makes us better organizers. It's within us already. It doesn't have to make a vaccine to make us big citizens who are engaged in what is happening in their communities. You don't need a vaccine for that. It's in us. It's always in this. When we see people from the bottom up, and this is when we feed them and we dispel the kind of levels of fear, and there are fears. There are ways in which they make us feel inadequate. There are ways in which they neutralize our power. We have to find ways in which we excel and expand our power as we the people.
Right. And I completely agree. And my last question is really, Danny, are you getting too old for this?
I am not getting. Sometimes I feel old, but I hope that as much as I've seen, um, I was listening to watching Jim Lawson
Uh,
at the eulogy for John Lewis,
uh-huh.
and boy was he something else. That was a 91-year-old Jim Lawson.
All
It
right.
wasn't. He probably had more power in 1953, as a young Jim Lawson, or 1960, as 60 years ago, as a 31-year-old
Right.
Jim Lawson. But I'll tell you what, he showed us something in his word and the texture of his word and the explosiveness of his words that, you know, there's a lot of left in the tank.
I know there
There's
is,
a
Dan.
lot of left in the
I
tank
know
here as
there is.
well.
I know there is. And, I think you've become a doyen in your field. And, I continue and I wish you the best of luck. You're always welcome back if you have any thoughts. And I'll be sure to link your social media accounts down below. And again, I thank you for taking your time and answering my questions. I really appreciate it.
For now, thank you for making this happen.
For
It
sure.
only happens because you were persistent
Of
in,
course.
in, in saying, let's do this.
Of course.
Because we know that whatever we do, it's our expression of our ideas and our expression of the possibility, even as a senior, even as someone who basically is considered, they call me Baba. You know what it means? It was
Right.
just a
Right.
sign of reverence and everything else.
Right.
And the fact that we're having this conversation, one generation to the emerging generation, the
Right.
generation that is now, the generation of this moment. That's a beautiful thing, brother.
Yeah. You kind of left me speechless, but I'll leave it right there. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can keep fighting the progressive fight. For anybody who's interested, please check out Danny Glover's movies. Personally, I've seen all of them, but for those of you that are, all right, brother. We'll
All
talk.
right, then, brother. Thank you, brother.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Peace out.
All right, then.
All right.